Last time we were right in the middle of the Oxford movement, and we're picking up where we left off then. We had a question last time that I needed to deal with. Someone asked me what the Reform Act and all those other things of 1832 and thereabouts, which enfranchised all kinds of groups that had been shoved out of English leadership, and voting and all the rest. If that did anything for women, the answer is absolutely nothing for women. Women's suffrage did not pass in England until in two stages in 1918 and in 1928. I want to talk to start with about the ideas of the Oxford movement and their whole sense of where the Christian life ought to be, how it ought to be lived, how it needs to progress, and the role of the church in that, which was quite different from what evangelicals and liberals in the Church of England were teaching. For one thing, and clearly, the principles of revelation and of authority were basic. The church's truth is revealed by God, and the church's authority comes from God. Newman develops these ideas throughout his career, John Henry Newman, an independent parallel with S.T. Coleridge, the Romantic poet and philosopher. Humans, Newman said, and the whole movement agreed with this, humans were made in God's image, all of them. And that what brought that, what came with that was a deep hunger for truth in the reason and a deep moral sense in the conscience. People hunger for truth. People hunger for goodness. But due to the damage done to human nature by the fall of Adam and Eve, no one succeeds in themselves, by themselves, in fully obeying that instinct for truth and goodness and following it where it would lead. What is required is for the church to start you off in that pilgrimage, to start off and support you throughout this life. Truth presented in clear teaching objectively, and also offering through the sacraments the grace to direct and empower and transfigure the moral sense. One begins the journey by assenting to the faith of the church. That is just saying, this is the faith of the church. I don't understand it, but I'm going to go along with it. I'm going to believe it. I'm going to assent to it. Then, in that setting, obeying the faith's spiritual and moral implications as life goes on, thus growing gradually in communion with the real God. Contact with that spiritual reality brings eventually a kind of sureness, a kind of confidence that they call consent. Assent is where you start. Consent is when you understand and are deeply, deeply formed by those realities. For that intellectual and moral development to happen, the integrity and the authority of the church is absolutely critical. The faith that Paul says justifies us, the faith that saves, isn't the conversion experience or anything foggy in your head. The faith that saves is the faith of the church. The objective truth the church teaches, what's in the creeds and what's in the prayer book, the faith of the church. And the Oxford movement, John Henry Newman and the rest, strongly emphasized the need for historical continuity in that witness, all through Christian history, all from the time of the apostles to the present, originating from Christ himself, apostolic and patristic doctrine, and a succession of bishops who are teaching that doctrine from God, That was our guarantee of access to God's salvation. The church has to be visible in its apostolic organization. It always has been through time, and it always has to be. It's itself given by God, defined by the church's teaching and the church's sacraments, given by God. Consistent, the Tractarians, the Oxford movement, had a consistent movement to objectivity. They wanted to focus on the objective apostolic succession of bishops, which made that strong link, both of teaching and of sacramental life, certain, and the real presence in the Eucharist, which was a hard sell in England in the 19th century, but which the Oxford movement gradually and with great clarity strongly affirmed. Newman redefines Anglicanism as a via media. He was really the first to put it quite that way, a via media between papism on one hand and Protestantism on the other, in which the church was Catholic with a small c, the simple, basic Catholic and apostolic deposit kept faithfully, thus making the Church of England a branch, as he put it, a branch of the uninterrupted and undivided Catholic Church. In its substance, undiluted by evangelical or liberal sources on one hand, and uncorrupted by what they regarded as Roman Catholic superstitions on the other hand. Further, the church is not only apostolic, the church has to be holy, otherworldly in the sense of it pointing steadily to God, otherworldly for the sake of this world, witness to the reality of God consistently. What helps that is to do what the Protestants in England were unwilling to do, which is to recognize saints, not just as everybody who believes, which is the New Testament meaning of the word of saints, but rather the people in whom the grace of God was particularly visible and active, people like St. Francis or St. Clare, recognizing saints as women and men in whom that grace is visible and active. The church also, when necessary, has to stand against the tendencies of the world around it. It can only be the nation's soul if it doesn't lose its own soul. That was the basic way in which the Oxford movement saw what they were after and what they preached, what Newman preached at St. Mary's Church in Oxford consistently, and all the others did too, wherever they could. Between 1833 and Keeble's sermon on national apostasy and 1840, the struggle began. During those years, those 7 years, there was increasing number of disciples and popularity of the movement. Newman's great series of sermons, which still make great reading, at St. Mary's, Oxford, had a profound impact. It wasn't just that people came to hear them, they were copied, they were published, they were out there in the national domain. Opposition was growing as well, especially among evangelicals who were loyal to the Reformation and liberals who were loyal to the Enlightenment. Also, they couldn't quite bring the whole old high church movement entirely on board. But still, even though there was some resistance and opposition that was growing, and a lot of people writing a lot of things in popular press against the movement, in 1841, Newman made a great, from the point of the Oxford movement, he made a great mistake. Remember that they were publishing a series of tracts called Tracts for the Times, short essays that were published for people to read that pushed the ideals of the movement. Newman published the 90th of those tracts, tract 90. And in that, he said that the 39 articles, which you can look up in the back of your prayer book, by the way, the 39 articles, the Church of England's basic teaching out of the Reformation, which was a requirement, not for lay people, but for ordination. You had to assent to it to be ordained. The 39 articles was strongly Protestant. Those articles, the 39 articles, were not, Newman claimed, inconsistent with the decrees of the Roman Catholic Council of Trent, which was the great Roman Catholic excommunication of the whole Protestant movement, which had set one against the other for centuries. Newman said, and he was very subtle about this, he'd said, we're not interpreting those documents as those documents were intended by the people who wrote them. We've got the words in those documents, and those words can be harmonized with each other as we understand those words. There was a violent reaction to Tract 90 on all sides, except from the movement itself. There was accusations of intellectual dishonesty and crypto-papism, which was there was relatively little rigorous theological argument with Tract 90. It was mostly personal attacks on Newman himself and his character, after which he would write his apology for his life, his argument that he had operated in good faith, but that was published long after. In 1843, E.B. Pusey, the New Testament professor, who had published a couple of big books on the real presence in the Eucharist, was put on trial for that ecclesiastically, and for of the real presence of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist, and forbidden to preach for 2 years. The Oxford Movement member, R.G. Ward, who was as close to Rome as you could get without being a Roman Catholic, wrote a burning little book, which he entitled The Ideal Church, which meant to be as much like Rome as we could possibly be without the Pope. And the university took his academic degrees away from him. That's what degrading means in the 19th century. He was degrading. Newman was deeply shaken by these things, but also, and finally and definitively, by the English government's plans to unite the English and Prussian bishoprics of Jerusalem into just one bishopric. The problem with that was in which the two nations would take turns to appoint a bishop. The problem was that with that, and as Newman saw it, and as the whole Oxford movement saw it, was that there was the Prussian church was absolutely Protestant. It made no claims to having bishops in the apostolic succession. If they appointed a bishop, it would be somebody who was ignoring that. And Newman just thought, and so did the movement as a whole, that that was fundamentally breaking down one of the absolutely central bulwarks of the church's life. It would meant in 1845, Newman made a couple of very big moves. One was to publish perhaps his greatest book, entitled The Development of Doctrine, far beyond the old Anglican understanding that there had been an unchanged deposit of faith from the apostles on, with no change in that. He showed that doctrine had developed over the centuries. and he thought it was faithful and right that in the power of the Holy Spirit it should do so. But he really, as he published that book, he lost his faith in the Church of England altogether. He was received as a Roman Catholic. He was soon ordained a Roman Catholic priest, and after that was soon named a cardinal in the Roman Church. That was the death blow to the Tractarian movement as such. A good many followed Ward and Newman into the Roman Church. Although Keble and Pusey stayed faithful to the Church of England, and they gained others like the ritualist and hymnographer John Mason Neale, who dies in 1866. There were many supporters of the movement still in the Church of England, and soon it took over most of the high church party in America, in the Episcopal Church in America. Ongoing struggle and development happened, not only of Catholic doctrine, but of worship and music. There we come to the part of the story that has the most immediate relevance to the way we do things here at this parish. This happened not so much at Oxford, but after Newman's defection, it happened largely at Cambridge University and a society called the Camden Society, which did a lot of research into the liturgy of the church and the ritual that they could observe had accompanied it before the Reformation and outside of the Reformation. John Mason Neale was one of the major figures in this. His big question was, how can ordinary people be led to worship? It's one thing to have this business about assent and consent growing in someone's life. How do you get them in there to start with? How do you get them to begin to adore God in what they do in church? He thought that the Reformation had brought about a loss of, and the Enlightenment too, had brought about a loss of beauty and any sense of holiness or divine mystery. He wanted to reclaim the Middle Ages, not only for faith, but for its architecture. How many churches do you see outside of California, which are Gothic churches? That's all medieval architecture, which was all adopted. Churches were not built that way prior to the 19th century and the ritualist movement in Cambridge. But that really caught fire. People loved the mystery of Gothic architecture, the play of shadow and light, which was so different from the big Enlightenment churches that had huge windows shedding sunlight on the whole assembly. They went back to the Middle Ages for its poetry, for its music, and soon they did research in its liturgical ritual and its vestments, which they started bit by bit to try to reclaim. The sense of continuity of Christianity through all its ages was strong against Protestant Enlightenment discontinuity, now moving into the visual and the musical. Recovery of vestments, like the chasuble I was wearing this morning, and the albs that the other ministers of the Eucharist were wearing. Those are Eucharistic vestments from the Middle Ages. They were not in use in the Church of England at all. But now they were beginning to be used. And oh, was there controversy about that? Early on, they made chasubles and stoles out of white fabric that matched the white surplice of the person wearing them. So it looked like they were just wearing the Anglican surplice, and you couldn't tell they were wearing a chasuble and a stole. It took step by step by step by step to get anywhere with all of that. There was bitter struggle and there was legal action. For example, legal action in the courts from evangelicals and liberals in the Church of England forced the new stone altars, which were being put in churches of the Oxford movement, to be removed in a return to the Reformation's wooden tables. Attempts to reserve the Blessed Sacrament, as we do here, to keep it in a tabernacle or an aumbry. Attempts to reserve it were met by violent popular riots. John Mason Neal was tried himself as a priest and inhibited from any exercise of the priesthood for 14 years. That just made him write and research more and more and more and still be a great leader of the movement, but he couldn't function as a priest for 14 years. This was kind of almost martyrdom that fueled the movement in many ways. He loved to make research in hymnody, especially the hymns of the ancient church and the Church of the Middle Ages. In addition to the Wesleys, there was a big recovery of medieval music, congregational singing of hymns, chant by the priest, and formal choirs, vested choirs, which there weren't any really outside of the cathedrals in England, and a movement to actually have those choirs come in a procession, not just walking in. A watchword was from the Bible, the beauty of holiness. What's holy is beautiful. What's really beautiful is holy too. And the church should engage all of that. And that's what's going to bring ordinary people in, not just in the pews, but into worship, to adore the living God, and to undertake this journey from ascent to consent. Investigation of the Sarum rite, that was the chief medieval rite in England, which the Catholic Church used in England. They investigated that as an example of the English way of celebrating the Eucharist prior to the Reformation. They used that increasingly as a guide to how the liturgy should be performed. Somehow you had to take the very Protestant Eucharistic rite from the prayer book and fit that into the Sarum rite, which was hard to do, but they did it anyway, increasingly, and got in trouble for it right and left and did it anyhow. Some priests snuck over to France to see how Roman Catholics were doing it. And they couldn't do that in England, but they could do that in France, and they did, and brought back the word just exactly how they were doing it there. There was some division in what we call the ritualist movement. That's this whole movement I'm talking about now. The ritualist movement from Cambridge and Catholic Society. There was some, not division exactly, but a distinction between the priests who wanted to follow what the Roman Catholics did, who wanted to stay as close to the Roman Church as they could without becoming Roman Catholics, without ascending to the papacy, and without leaving the Church of England. When they approached the altar, they genuflected, went all the way down on one knee, or if the Blessed Sacrament was exposed, both knees. The other group said, well, no, we want English examples. We'll follow the Sarum rite. And in the Sarum rite, people didn't genuflect, they bowed, profound bowing instead. So you used to be able to tell just how high an Anglo-Catholic Church was by whether everybody was genuflecting or by where everyone was bowing. And they did say, it's just important not to mix the two things up. Another thing that was happening was the restoration in the Church of England and then in the American Episcopal Church of monastic life. All the monasteries in England had been closed, and monasticism was against the law in England right until this time. And they started to do it anyway. Violent opposition to monasticism, the basic part of the popular polemic against papism. In this movement, it was strong women who led the way, among them especially Priscilla Lydian Sellon, who dies in 1876. She formed the Society of the Most Holy Trinity, with important support from John Mason Neal on the sidelines and acting as best he could do, and other leaders. This was important not only for her, the support was important not only for her own order, but for other new sisterhoods. They got protection from Bishop Wilberforce of Oxford, and that permitted the formation of sisterhoods in the face of great popular and episcopal prejudice against it. They slowly introduced special clothing to mark themselves as nuns. The habits were only slowly and gradually introduced so as not to shock anybody unnecessarily. And even more controversially, they started to have vows that you would take when you join the order. Temporary vows to start with, and life vows after you were truly a full member of the group. That was done again step by step and mostly very quietly. There was substantial persecution, and they were working on the basis of very slender financial resources, but strong principles and steady growth was what they experienced. It took great courage and vision of those women. The example of Florence Nightingale was powerful in that respect. Women serving actively in society. And she did employ some Anglican sisters as nurses. There was informal but functional men's monasteries similar to Newman's Circle that he had formed at his home in Littleworth before he became a Roman Catholic. Those informal men's groups became formal later, but it took longer. It was a much more gradual process even. The male orders were somehow seen as more threatening by the people who were opposing the movement. Just to give you an example there's a whole host of sisterhoods. There's a whole host of men's ones as well. There's for women, I've just introduced the Society of the Most Holy Trinity. There's the nuns of the Holy Nativity. There's the St. Helena nuns. There's a wide variety of sisterhoods. And the men, when they finally are able to get together and have a society of that kind, form what used to be called the Cowley Fathers, the Society of St. John the Evangelist, and the Community of the Resurrection at Mirfield in England. Those have their analogs here in America, including a very active version of the Society of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The expansion of those orders in ministry and service, and then some of them moving towards a contemplative order, that did more than anything else to change the spiritual tone and character of Anglicanism to the present day. They were very influential. In a quiet way, they simply were kind of like yeast in the dough, and they made a big difference in the whole tone and character of the Anglican Church. And that was maybe especially true in America. What was the aftermath of the Oxford movement and the Cambridge ritualist movement? Well, there was continuing progress of the principles by which they operated, especially in a renaissance of patristic learning and liturgics, the reassessment of medieval religion, which continued to recover from the Reformation, sacramentalism, turning deeply to the sacraments, which through the 18th century were, except for baptism, were seldom performed and seldom thought about particularly. That changed. Sacerdotalism, where priests are supposed to function as priests, unsecularized by the Reformation or liberal parties. There was a deep confrontation with a cultural crisis in the Oxford movement, and that diminished. The sense that they were opposed to the popular culture diminished, especially in America, where the situation was so different after the Second Great Awakening. The nature of the church as one holy Catholic and apostolic was still strongly affirmed. There was an effort continuing to remove and obscure Reformation influences. When I was on my second sabbatical in Cambridge University, the Bishop of Ely, who was in charge of Cambridge, sent me to say, knowing that I was an Anglo-Catholic, sent me to say Mass on Wednesday mornings at Little St. Mary's in Cambridge. Little St. Mary's is an Anglican Church of England parish where the whole idea of the Reformation is a distant rumor of something horrible happening in Germany. For them, nothing has changed. Even Vatican II hasn't made a big impact. It has on their preaching and teaching, but not in the way they do their literature. My guidebook as to saying those masses was to follow Adrian Fortescue's The Mass of the Roman Rite described, every single gesture and movement in it, which I did perfectly because I was being carefully watched as I did it. There was growth in America of the movement. If you wonder about that, there's a bunch of places I can recommend that you go to find it out, and not least here. A fierce battle emerged in the 19th century and early 20th century between the high and low church and the Episcopal Church, both sides of them growing. The Book of Common Prayer of 1979, which is the source of our liturgy now, marks a major change. It's not medieval. It's not Reformation in Rite II. It's patristic. It's out of the early urban churches in the Roman Empire, the urban world, which matched the urban world of England and America, although the 79 book is only used here, but similar ones are normally used in England now. This was not a triumph of the Middle Ages. Those liturgies are not medieval, but it is a triumph of the ritualist movement. Holy Week was restored in its fullness. Only Anglo-Catholic churches had celebrated Holy Week as Holy Week, and all of that having to supplement what was in the old prayer book from other sources. With actual palms on Palm Sunday, Anglicans had not used palms on Palm Sunday for hundreds of years. Ashes on Ash Wednesday, they hadn't used ashes for hundreds of years. We now have that overtly in the prayer book. To have classical vestments, to bow or genuflect as people choose to the altar and to the Blessed Sacrament, reservation of the Blessed Sacrament so that Jesus' body and blood is always here under the form of bread and wine, giving last rites. All of that comes to be possible in the Book of Common Prayer of 1979. Understanding the Eucharist as a sacrifice is a bigger stretch, but it is still adumbrated there in ways that had never been before. Perhaps most of all, the understanding of the Eucharist as the proper worship for every Sunday morning, for every Saturday night or Sunday morning. That had not been the case. What had been the case back in the 17th century was that when you went to church in the morning, and everybody had to, you had a full morning prayer, followed immediately by the Great Litany, followed by the first part of the Eucharistic rite, ante-communion. You only actually had the communion about 4 times a year. But that was a long, long stretch of time that people spent in church. That got unpopular in the 19th century. So what happened was the low church here in America, the low part of the Episcopal Church, adopted the morning prayer and sermon as the normal thing to do on Sunday morning, with maybe monthly or maybe quarterly communions. And the high church adopted just the Eucharist freestanding, not with the litany and morning prayer attached to it, with a sermon. Both of them taking up offerings, which was not possible in morning prayer all by itself. Offerings being extremely important in the Episcopal Church. Finally, there was tremendous action, transforming action in the missions. The Oxford movement itself did not have a terribly keen social conscience for the poor. But what happened was that bishops who had to ordain young Oxford movement priests, they didn't have much choice if they were qualified, but they did have a choice where the parishes they were sent to. They were sent to the slums, to what is cheerfully called in England punishment parishes. And in the slums, they encountered the terrible problems of the poor and proletariat in England, and tried to attract those people into church, and became far more active. That led to a strong tradition of Anglo-Catholic social action. One of the great writers of the 20th century in this field was Kenneth Leach, who was a very advanced Anglo-Catholic and at the same time a very strong socialist. That was not a surprise, because in the 20th century, even the hierarchy in England became partisans of socialism for the sake of the poor, to make some kind of change on the. Now, that is no longer the case. The care for the poor is the case, but the union with socialism didn't left tremendous monuments behind it, especially the National Health Service in England. But in America, nothing quite like that ever could happen. There's a lot to be said about all of that. There were also international missions. The evangelicals were doing that, and so were the Anglo-Catholics in different countries, in different ways, with different societies. In Tanzania, the remaining Christians in Zanzibar are extremely high church, Anglo-Catholics. The Anglicans in Tanganyika, which is part of Tanzania, of course, as is Zanzibar, the Christians there, which are far more numerous, are evangelicals. I once asked a Tanzanian evangelical bishop how they got along with Zanzibar. And he said, which just sounds so much like Tanzanian mindset, he said, they love Jesus in the Eucharist, and we love Jesus in the Bible. So make of that what you will. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was an Anglo-Catholic. God rest his soul and bless his name. He would say the Eucharist daily, even when he was on an 18-hour flight. He would have a flight attendant bring him some bread and some wine, and he would just put down his tray and celebrate the Eucharist right on his tray to make sure that happened. It was going to be a daily matter for him, and it always was. And the strength of his witness in South Africa was not unique. He was the great figure of all of that, and I am so proud to have met him on numerous occasions. But there were many others like him who pushed for the end of apartheid, and did so out of the deepest kinds of Christian principles. So that's a sketch of the Oxford movement and the ritualist movement that came out of it. So much of what we can do here and have the freedom to do here is only possible because of those movements. It would not have happened otherwise. So when you see me or Father Ricardo or Father Ernest celebrating the Eucharist here, you'll see us following a ritual which is okay in the 79 book, but which is strongly marked by the whole Anglo-Catholic movement, which made it possible for us to worship in that kind of fundamentally reverent and beautiful way. And we are very grateful for the support of this whole congregation and the support of all the people behind the scenes who make it possible, not least the Altar Guild and all the altar servers, which are, and our wonderful choir, which we have back, all of which is a great blessing and which would warm the heart of anybody in the Cambridge movement. Mm-hmm. Questions or issues in our few minutes of remaining time?
The Diocese of Massachusetts was the epitome of low church. Yes. When I started out, we'd have Eucharist on the first Sunday of the month and then morning prayer, the rest. And I snuck in a third Sunday Eucharist by calling the family Eucharist when the children could come, etc., etc. But it was a huge thing when Tom Shaw, the head of the St. John of,
St. John the Evangelist,
the Cali Fathers, was elected bishop of Massachusetts. That was unbelievable. Amazing. He was a wonderful man and dear friend, and just everybody celebrated. But oh my God, the significance of that was incredible.
It was enormous because there had been violently high churches like the Church of the Advent in Boston, which was indistinguishable from a Roman Catholic Church, except they didn't pray for the Pope most days. But snake belly low and nosebleed high live together in whatever harmony they could possibly have under those circumstances. Massachusetts was an interesting, eclectic group. Still is.
The question, when you talk about they faced opposition in England, was that opposition from the archbishopric? Where was the opposition?
They had a lot of the bishops opposed them. Most of the bishops had been appointed by the prime ministers who wanted bishops who would support them in the House of Lords, whatever their political agenda was. And so they mostly appointed fairly political bishops who weren't either deep evangelicals or deep Anglo-Catholics of either kind. And they didn't like any of these changes, and pushed hard against them. But there were bishops who did support it, like Bishop Wilberforce in Oxford, who gave them some cover and didn't put them all on trial all the time for doing what they were doing. But there was a lot of popular feeling about this. It's hard to overestimate the depth of fear and hatred of Roman Catholicism in the ordinary people of England at that time. It had run deeply since the Reformation. It had been reinforced ever since then, and it was alive. I mean, they still celebrate Guy Fawkes Day in England, where they're burning a Roman Catholic revolutionary as part of their celebration. That's lost a lot of its edge. It's mostly just a bonfire for people now, but it sure wasn't back in the 19th century.
A lot of this seems like an academic exercise between the elites and the church. That really didn't have a lot to do with the congregation. Right?
Oh, no. It had everything to do with the congregation.
But didn't the congregations have any choice in it?
Sure, they could go to a different parish if they didn't like the parish they were going to, although that was hard to do. You were supposed to go to the parish in your own geographical area. But there's a very funny book called Merrily on High, which is written by a fairly extreme Anglo-Catholic Anglican English priest, who says that too many of his Anglo-Catholic colleagues judged the adequacy of how high they were by how hard the door was slamming as people were leaving the church. So both ways, all three ways, it was controversial and difficult. Right now, I was a priest in the Diocese of Durham in England, and right next to our ministry group, there was an evangelical Anglican ministry group that would not baptize babies at all.
Oh,
They were functionally Baptists,
goodness.
and the way they worshiped was functionally Baptist. If you go to Cambridge and you go to Church of England churches, you'll get everything from something that is indistinguishable from a Baptist church to something that is indistinguishable from a Roman Catholic church, except praying for the Pope. And the whole range in between.
Wow.
And a parish, and in that case, it's easy enough to go to the parish that you really like. And people did.
Just as an anecdote, when Pam was here, and she grew up in England, London. One day she said when she was small, she found a small statuette of Mary on the ground, so she picked it up and really liked it because it was a nice little statuette. But her mother said, "Oh, that's an old Catholic thing. Throw that away."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a perfect example of how that was still happening.
I didn't realize, you talked a lot about all this politics and the appointment of bishops. I just put it together when you said, oh, the bishops were in the House of Lords. I didn't even know that. How much of the House of Lords were religious clergy?
Roughly a fourth to a third of it. And they mostly attended when the House of Lords was in session, and they weren't perfectly united as a church bloc, except when laws were being passed that were clearly going to damage the Church of England, lock, stock, and barrel. But when the Reform Act was being passed, They said the galleries in the House of Lords and in the House of Commons were solid black from all the priests that were there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, now the bishops are still in the House of Lords, but only 4 of them. But they still, I was there once when a law was, they have very little power now in the House of Lords, but they have a voice, and they use that voice. I was there when a treaty was being negotiated between Nigeria, which was part of the Commonwealth, and was at that point, and Great Britain. That was much to the advantage of Great Britain, much to the disadvantage of Nigeria. And a bishop stood up, and he just took off against it. He said, "This is wrong. Those are human beings made in the image of God, just like everybody here is. Many of them are Christians. Many of them care passionately about their relationship with Great Britain and don't want to be exploited that way anymore, the way that they had been under colonialism for so long. So they have a voice, and they use that voice. How much influence it actually has, it's all in the House of Commons that the law actually gets passed now. And there, the voice is much diminished.
I just wanted to remind myself out loud of that phrase that we learned in seminary, the low and lazy, broad and hazy, high and crazy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Father Bill.
Yeah.